People around here know me as the guy who fixes things. Leaky faucet, broken screen door, a neighbor's porch steps that have been rotting since the Clinton administration. I'm the one they call. I've lived in the same house in Dayton, Ohio for 31 years. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 with a dent on the passenger side that I keep meaning to fix but never do. I mow my own lawn. I shop at the same Kroger every Saturday morning. I am, by every measure, an ordinary 67-year-old man living an ordinary life. And that's exactly how I like it. What people don't know, what I almost never talk about, is what I did for the 22 years before I became the guy with the F-150 and the dented fender. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My daughter's name is Simone. She's 38, sharp as a tack, works in corporate finance for a mid-sized manufacturing firm up in Columbus. She got her mother's brains and, unfortunately, my stubbornness, which is a combination that has served her well and made her teenage years genuinely exhausting. Her husband's name is Donovan. He's been with her 11 years. Married for 7 of those, and I'll be honest, it took me a while to warm up to him. Not because of anything he did wrong, more because of the way he talked about things. Like every sentence was a transaction. Like everything had a return on investment. But he's good to my daughter, and he makes her laugh. And at 67, I've learned that those two things cover a lot of ground. They have a son, my grandson Cooper. He's 4, and he's the best thing I've seen in a long time. This story isn't really about Cooper, though. It's about a dinner, and a man named Aldrich Beaumont. Simone called me on a Tuesday evening in February, which was unusual because she usually texts. When she calls, it means something's either very good or very bad. "Dad," she said, "Donovan's firm is doing this client dinner next Friday. Big deal client, international. His boss wants the whole team to come, spouses and family included. It's supposed to look like community, like Roots." She paused. "Donovan wants to know if you'd come." "He wants me there?" "He does, actually. I know you two aren't. I mean, I know it sometimes a little." "I'll come," I said. She went quiet for a second. "Really? Your husband's asking for something. That doesn't happen often. I'm not going to say no." She laughed and it sounded relieved. The dinner was at a restaurant in Columbus called Maison Verlaine, French-inspired. The kind of place where they bring the bread to the table in a linen cloth and the menu doesn't have prices, which is not a cultural statement so much as a warning. I wore my gray wool blazer that had a dry clean twice in the past decade. Once for my sister's wedding and once for a funeral that I still don't like thinking about. I polished my shoes. I drove up Friday afternoon and stayed at Simone and Donovan's place. When I walked in that evening, I felt immediately that I was on the wrong side of a gap I hadn't known existed. The restaurant was all warm light and low conversation, and people who wore money the way I wear flannel. Naturally, without thinking about it, Donovan's colleagues were younger than I expected, early 40s mostly, the kind of men who say bandwidth in optics without irony. Donovan introduced me to his boss first. His name was Aldrich Beaumont. He was maybe 55, tall, with one of those deeply tanned faces that comes from expensive vacations rather than outdoor work. French-Canadian, I learned. Grew up in Montreal, went to school in Paris, had been living in the States for 15 years. He spoke English with a faint accent that he seemed to deploy selectively, letting it appear when it suited him and disappear when it didn't. He shook my hand and smiled with the part of his face above his cheekbones and said very warmly, "Simone's father, what a pleasure. Donovan speaks very highly of your family." I thanked him. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. He asked what I did, and I told him I was retired. He asked from what, and I said government work. He nodded in a way that suggested he'd filed that information in the drawer marked unimportant and moved on. We were seated at a long table. I was near the far end between Simone and a quiet man named Fletcher who worked in logistics and seemed as out of place as I felt. Aldrich was at the head, next to the client, a European investor named Pieter, Dutch, well-dressed, who had a financial stake in whatever the firm was trying to close. Dinner began. Conversation moved around the table like water finding its level. I ate my duck confit and listened more than I talked, which is something I got good at a long time ago. It was somewhere between the main course and dessert that I noticed it. Aldrich had been speaking with Pieter in French for stretches of the evening. The client clearly preferred it. But at some point, Aldrich leaned slightly toward the younger man to his left, one of Donovan's colleagues, a guy named Reston who'd been smirking all evening, and said something in French, low enough that I don't think he thought anyone else would catch it. But I was watching the room the way I always watch rooms, and I caught every word. What he said, translated, was something close to, "The father-in-law is charming. Very blue collar. You can see why Donovan keeps him at a distance." Reston smiled and said quietly, "Does he even know what he ordered?" They both made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I took a sip of my water. I looked at my duck. I set my fork down very gently on the edge of my plate. I didn't say anything. Not then. Simone had been talking to the woman across from her and hadn't heard. Donovan was deep in conversation with Pieter about return timelines. Nobody at our end of the table had caught it either, except maybe Fletcher, whose French wasn't good enough to follow. I sat with it. Ate my meal. Listened to the conversation around me. Thought about things. I thought about a kitchen table in Cincinnati, where I grew up, my father eating dinner in his work clothes because he never had time to change before the food went cold. I thought about my mother, who read 2 books a week from the public library and never once talked about it like it was an accomplishment. I thought about all the ways a person can be underestimated and what you choose to do about it. I thought about my daughter, who was sitting next to me laughing at something, completely unaware that her husband's boss had just decided, in a language he assumed I didn't speak, that I was decoration. And I thought about Donovan, who had asked me here, who had, in his stilted, transactional way, extended something that cost him something to extend. I decided to wait. There's something I should explain. From 1981 to 2003, I worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency. I am not going to describe exactly what I did in any detail, partly because some of it is still not mine to describe, and partly because the specific shape of the work matters less than what it required of me. What it required, among other things, was language. I came in with a background in linguistics from Ohio State. Over the years, I developed working fluency in German, French, and Russian, with enough Arabic to be functional in specific contexts. French came first and came easiest. I had a facility for it that my instructors noted early, and by the late 80s, I could conduct a full operational debrief in French without a note in front of me. I left the service in 2003. I came home to Dayton. I bought a house, fixed things, drove my truck, lived quietly. I don't talk about those years much. Not because I'm ashamed of them, because they belong to a version of me that other people don't need to carry around. My daughter knows I did intelligence work. She doesn't know the details. That was a deliberate choice I made when she was young, and I've never revisited it. The point is this. Aldrich Beaumont had spent a pleasant dinner speaking freely in a language he was certain I did not understand. He was mistaken. Dessert was a lavender cream brulee that I ate very slowly. Coffee came. The evening moved toward its close. Aldrich was in an expansive mood. The dinner had gone well. Pieter was pleased. The deal was moving in the right direction. He was telling a story in English now, something about a sailing trip off the coast of Brittany, and the table was listening with the kind of attentive laughter that happens when the person telling the story controls everyone's salaries. There was a pause, one of those natural silences in a long dinner when the air settles. I spoke. I said in French, and I want to be precise here, because the register mattered, in the kind of French you use in a professional setting in Paris, not the Montreal variant he grew up with, which has its own rhythms and idioms, but the standard Parisian French that signals a particular kind of education. I hope the rest of your evening continues as well as this one has. The table went quiet, not all at once. In a ripple. Aldrich turned to look at me. I watched the color in his face do something complicated. I continued, still in French, addressing Pieter now. I've enjoyed your comments this evening about the Baltic market. I spent some time in that part of the world in the late 90s. Different then, of course. Pieter brightened. He answered me in French, and we spoke for a few exchanges. Comfortable, collegial. He asked about my background. I told him briefly that I'd worked in government analysis. He said, in the tone of a man who had met a few people like that over the years, that it explained a few things. I let that sit. Then I turned back to the table at large, switched to English, and said something about the food being exceptional and that I was grateful to be included. The conversation restarted, a little unevenly at first, like an engine turning over in cold weather. Reston had found something important to study in his dessert spoon. Aldrich recovered faster than expected. He was smooth, I'll give him that, but there was a quality to his recovery that had lost something. The ease was gone, the certainty that he knew which way the room was tilted. Donovan, across the table, was looking at me. I gave him a small nod. He looked away. After dinner, in the parking garage, Simone took my arm while Donovan went to get the car. She said, "I didn't know you spoke French." "I don't talk about it," I said. "How well do you speak it?" "Well enough." She was quiet for a moment. Then, what did he say? "Before." "I saw your face change." I looked at her. She's 38 years old, and she knows me the way. Only people who have watched you for a long time know you. The way you can read a change in someone's posture across a crowded room. "He said something rude," I told her. "It wasn't important." Dad. It was about me, Simone. Not about you, not about Donovan. Me. And I handled it. She studied me for a moment. "Are you angry?" I thought about that honestly. "No, I'm really not." And I meant it. There was nothing left to be angry at. A man had decided in advance who I was and then discovered he was wrong. That's not a tragedy. That's just Tuesday. Donovan pulled up in his Audi. We got in. He didn't say anything until we were on the highway, and then he said, not looking at me, staring at the road, "What was that?" "What was what?" "In there, with Aldrich. What was that?" I complimented the evening, I said. Long silence, the headlights of other cars moving past. "You speak French," he said. "I do." "Since when?" "Since 1982 or so." He didn't say anything for a while. Then, did you hear what he said? "Before." "Yes." "And you waited until..." "Yes." He exhaled through his nose. Simone reached over and touched his arm. I watched the lights on the highway and thought about nothing in particular. That Saturday morning, I was back in Dayton by 9, at the Kroger by 9:30, back home with groceries by 10:15. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and read the paper. The radiator knocked the way it always does in February. The neighbor's dog barked twice and then was quiet. About 2 weeks later, Simone called again. "Something happened at work," she said. She told me that there had been a conversation. She didn't know all the details, but apparently Pieter, the Dutch investor, had followed up with the firm after the dinner. He'd been favorably impressed by the evening overall, but he'd also asked some questions about team culture. Specifically, he'd mentioned that he'd had a pleasant conversation with Donovan's father-in-law, and that it had given him confidence in the kind of people the firm valued. He'd said something, Simone was told the second hand, about preferring to work with organizations that treat everyone at the table with the same respect they'd show a client. She didn't know if anyone had put two and two together. She suspected Aldrich might have, but the deal had been signed, and Donovan had been given more responsibility in the new account, and his position within the firm had shifted noticeably in the weeks after that dinner. "I don't know what to make of any of it," she said. "Don't make anything of it," I told her. "It worked out right." "Did you plan that? The thing with Pieter?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "I just answered when it was time to answer." She was quiet for a moment. "He wants to apologize." "Donovan. He's been strange about it. I think he's embarrassed that he didn't know." "About your French?" "About any of it. He doesn't need to apologize. He thinks he does." "Then let him. But tell him it's not about what I can do or what I used to do. None of that matters. The only thing I ever wanted from him was to take care of you." She was quiet for a long moment after that. Donovan and I had dinner the following Sunday. Just the two of us, at a diner near his house, the kind of place with laminated menus and good pie. He apologized, not very gracefully, which I respected more than if he'd done it well. I told him I wasn't owed an apology by him for someone else's behavior. He said he felt like he should have. Should have what? He didn't finish the sentence. I told him I understood. We ate our eggs and talked about Cooper, who had recently decided that he was afraid of the vacuum cleaner and was handling it by growling at it, which strikes me as a reasonable strategy. We talked about the Ohio State game. We talked about the truck, because Donovan had noticed the dent and asked about it, and I told him the real story, which is that I backed into my own mailbox in 2017 because I was trying to look at a hawk on the telephone wire and wasn't paying attention. He laughed, a real one, not the transactional kind. It was a good meal. On the drive home, I thought about the things I've carried for a long time and the things I've been able to set down. I thought about the years of work that nobody knew about and the ways that kind of work changes you. Not always for the better, but sometimes in ways that turn out to be useful when you least expect them. I thought about sitting in a warm restaurant, listening to a man dismiss me in a language I knew better than he realized, and I thought about the particular calm that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't know. And I thought about what I told Simone in that parking garage. He was wrong about me. That's not a tragedy. That's just Tuesday. There's a thing I learned a long time ago in a line of work that required me to see people clearly and quickly and accurately. People reveal themselves when they think they're not being watched. Not their worst selves necessarily, just their true selves. The self they've decided it's safe to be when the room doesn't seem to be paying attention. Aldrich Beaumont saw an old man in a gray blazer at the end of the table and made a decision about who I was. He wasn't cruel about it exactly, just careless. And carelessness, in my experience, is usually the more honest thing. You can manage your cruelty. You can't always manage your assumptions. I don't carry any anger toward him. He didn't know. How would he? The only thing I'd want to say to him if I thought he'd hear it is what I try to say to myself when I find I'd made the same kind of mistake. And I have, more times than I'd like, which is simply this. The person sitting across from you has a whole life you can't see from where you're standing. Decades of experience, of work, of loss and learning. All of it invisible until it isn't. The quiet man at the end of the table was 22 years of intelligence work, 4 languages, 1,000 rooms. Like that one. And harder, a daughter he'd give anything for, a grandson who growls at vacuum cleaners, and a truck with a dent from watching a hawk. I am the guy who fixes things. That part is also true. I drove home, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table. The radiator knocked. Outside, the last of the February light was going flat and gray over the neighborhood. I thought, not bad for a Tuesday. I've been thinking about that dinner a lot lately. Not with bitterness, I want to be clear about that. More the way you think about a moment that taught you something you already knew, but hadn't put words to yet. Aldrich Beaumont made a choice that evening. A small one, the kind a person makes without much thought. The way you'd pick up a stone and toss it without checking what's on the other side. He looked at me and decided in about 30 seconds that I wasn't worth the effort of caution. And that decision, that one careless, unconsidered choice, is what undid him. Not anything I planned. Not any scheme I put together on the drive up to Columbus. Just the natural weight of his own assumptions pressing down on the wrong spot at the wrong moment. That's how it usually goes, in my experience. The consequences of treating people carelessly rarely arrive as some dramatic reckoning. They're quieter than that. A client who remembers a moment. A room that shifts almost imperceptibly. A man who spent 22 years learning to read rooms sitting at your table, listening, while you assumed he couldn't understand a word. I've made the same mistake Aldrich made. I want to say that plainly. I've walked into situations with my mind already made up about who the other person was, what they were worth, what they could or couldn't offer. And I've been wrong. Not always in ways that came back to me visibly. But wrong. And the older I get, the more I think that the discipline of not doing that, of actually looking at the person in front of you before you decide you already know them, is one of the hardest things a man can practice. It doesn't come naturally. It has to be worked at the way you work at anything that runs against an easy habit. The other thing I keep coming back to is patience. Not the passive kind, where you just absorb whatever happens and call it virtue. The active kind, the kind where you know what you know, and you choose the right moment to let it matter. I sat at that table for a long time before I said anything. And when I did speak, it wasn't out of anger. It was something quieter, a clarity about what the moment required and what it didn't. That kind of patience isn't something you're born with either. You build it, slowly, over years, in rooms a lot harder than a restaurant in Columbus. And then there's Donovan. I think about him too. He asked me to be there that night, and I don't think he fully knew why, not consciously. But something in him understood that showing up in all the ordinary, unglamorous, dented truck reality of who I am mattered. And it did. Not because I performed anything, just because I was there, being exactly who I am. That's the part I want Cooper to understand someday, when he's old enough. Not the French, not the intelligence career, not the moment Aldrich's face changed. Just this, the life you live quietly, the skills you build without announcing them, the character you hold on to when no one's watching. None of it is ever wasted. It accumulates. And one day, in a room you didn't expect, it will be exactly what's needed. I drove home Saturday morning, made coffee. Sat at my kitchen table while the radiator knocked. Same as always. Not bad for a Tuesday